Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Living with Lyme. We have a functional genetic nutritionist with us today. Her name is Emily Givler. And Emily came into my life because she actually has evaluated and looked at my genes. She's been able to help me a tremendous amount. She has a thriving practice in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I always laugh at you guys down south with counties. You know, isn't cities and towns good enough for you guys? She holds a degree in herbalism, and she is certified through genetic nutrition, actually functional genomic analysis. And if you're familiar with that name or you're not, it is associated with Bob Miller, who is the founder of this company. She uses dietary and nutritional means to help people with their genetic predispositions. She's a lecturer. She is an educator. She is an advocate. She works with all types of practitioners and all types of patients with chronic issues. One of the really coolest things that she does is she works with local, wait a minute, where is it? I'll find it right here. It is a local agricultural community. That's right. And as part of that, she's also involved in a nonprofit. And this is a combination thing. And the offshoot of that is she's actually having the capability now of working with moms across America and evaluating breast milk for glyphosate levels, which who would have even thought we needed to do that? But now in this world that we live in, we unfortunately have to do a lot more surveillance on the things that we're eating and obviously what our babies are eating. So for everybody out there, warm welcome, Emily Givler. Welcome to Living with Lyme.
Thank you so much for having me, Cindy. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Oh, it's so fun. It is so fun because learning, certainly you can sit and read a book and whatnot, but for me, I'm sure a lot of people, they like that interaction. They like to see or to hear.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people that are listening like to hear things in a way that they can be familiarized.
Okay.
You know, we all hear about genes, and we talk about genes because we're becoming more and more aware of our genes. So let's start at the top. What are your genes and where are they? And they're not in your closet, multiple sizes. Talking about your body.
Slightly different kinds of genes.
Yes,
so we're talking about.
I want you to proceed as if success is inevitable. Okay?
Excellent.
All right. Excellent.
All right.
Cheers. Cheers. What's your genes?
So your genes, so when we're talking about genes, we're talking about your DNA and the segments of the DNA, which is the code that makes you and me. The segments of genes of the DNA are called the genes, and they're found in the nucleus of almost every cell in your body.
Almost, or really all of them?
Almost every cell in the nucleus.
Okay.
So we say virtually every cell.
Okay.
So your cells contain your genetic material or your code. And we can think about genetics almost as the programming language for your body. So it's kind of interesting that we're more familiar with programming a computer than we are ourselves, but it's the same basic idea that you have this little code within your body that tells enzymes how to work and proteins how to fold and unfold, and all of the biochemistry of the body really gets its instructions from your genes in the DNA. And then what we do with the functional genetics is to get even into tinier, smaller segments called SNPs, SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And so these are the tiny little segments where there may be what we call variants. And the variants may change how that code is read by the body. And if we understand how your code differs from my code, we can figure out really nuanced ways to support the system and determine what makes each of us bio-individual and unique, and help us to really find what works for us biochemically so that we can truly thrive.
So I understand that we may have variances, but those are only predisposing factors.
Yes.
So yes, go ahead.
We have this massive amount of genetic material. So I always love the example of the amount of retroviral DNA that we have in our body. So in your body, the retroviral DNA, just these tiny little portions of it, if you would stretch it out into a straight line, it's long enough to wrap around the earth 150,000 times. And that's about 8% of your total DNA. So it's this massive amount of code. When we look at things like SNPs within the protein coding DNA, it's very small changes. So it's not enough that, you know, you've grown a third arm or something like that. These are small changes, enough to impact things like with MTHFR, how you're metabolizing folate. But we're not talking about one gene doing just one thing. So we're looking at interconnected pathways. So what's helpful for me is to think about the genetics more as a set of scales. And when we have variants, it may tip the scales one way, something else may tip it back the other way and may compensate for it. So we have to be careful not to put too much emphasis on any one gene or one SNP or one variant or change. It's something that may tip the scales, but we have to look at the big picture, because what counterbalances are there? What is exacerbating it and making it worse? And when we look at with the work that I do, we look at about 9,000 to 12,000 SNPs actively to create that whole picture. So one of the places people really go wrong with the SNPs is putting too much emphasis on them and looking at it as a death sentence or an inevitability, and they are most certainly not. They're predispositions that are going to be influenced by environmental factors. And when we have a genetically vulnerable person who encounters an environmental toxin that impacts them along that weak pathway, they're going to feel that more than the average person. And when we understand those pathways and those nuances in how we interact and interface with the world, then we can take the appropriate steps for us. And what's right for me may end up being totally wrong for you because of those small changes.
Right. So we have the ability to have both. If we're looking in one segment, maybe we're looking at GI. Let's think of the areas that go along with GI. You can have one variant in this little segment, or you can have two. Can you describe those? Well, look, it looks like
sure.
I'm milking a cow.
So, well, and we did mention that I'm from Lancaster County, so that's
well,
appropriate.
There's a lot of cows out there. That's right.
So when we're looking at the SNPs and the DNA, we get our DNA from mom and dad, and so we have two copies of each SNP. We've got a copy from mom and a copy from dad. So you could have what's called the wild type allele, where everything is the predicted copy. It's the same as most people. So that's the wild type. So that would be everything fine. If you have variants, you can have a single or a heterozygous variant. So one of your two copies would be what's considered the risk allele, and the other would be the wild type. Or you could have a homozygous presentation where both copies, the one from mom and the one from dad, are both the variated copy or that risk allele. So you're only going to have one copy of that gene expressed at a time. Only one of the two is going to be working. So when there's a heterozygous variant, we always have the question of what's actually being expressed. Like, is that actively creating an issue for you? And so with the work that we do, we want to think about the genes as a predisposition and then use things like functional lab testing to determine expression. And if you have a gene that's expressing and creating symptoms and issues, those are the places that you want to support.
So where did this come about? This seems like all of a sudden we're exploding into learning about our genetic predispositions. Is there some sort of a timeline of how this has become more common?
Well, I think that we're really standing on the shoulders of giants, and this has been a long time building since Watson and Crick and the discovery of DNA, which was really not all that long ago. So in the past 15 years, our understanding of genetics has really exploded. And it's being driven from a number of different fronts. The pharmaceutical industry is very interested in genetics and being able to market drugs to certain people. There are, even in my natural health perspective, some upshots to that. The more we can understand about things like how our phase 1 liver detox pathways work, we may be able to save a lot of people a lot of really dangerous problems because they may metabolize certain pharmaceutical agents differently than others. So the medical community is doing their own kind of thing with genetics, but within the natural health community, genetics is really having its heyday. And from where we started about 10 to 15 years ago was with MTHFR, and which is our final step in folate metabolization. And when we look at MTHFR, there are still a lot of people who, if they know one thing about genetics, they've heard of MTHFR, and they think that it's, and a lot of people still think that it's a really critical issue, and it's not nothing, but our understanding of genetics and how there's this dynamic interplay of all of these different genes has really exploded. So we've come a long way from that one gene doing one thing, like, oh, you have MTHFR, you need to take 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate forever in massive amounts. We now know that that's probably wrong for most people most of the time, but 15 years ago, that was the first thing that really got our attention in the health and nutrition community. Like, oh, something as basic as folate and folic acid may be metabolized completely differently in one body versus another. With a MTHFR C677T mutation, which is one tiny little snip in that MTHFR pathway, you can see up to a 70% difference in folate metabolization. So that can be significant, but it's rarely the only thing that's going on. We all have hundreds, if not thousands, of polymorphisms or variants along these SNPs. And so how they fit together, plus what environmental toxins and life stresses and traumas, all of those things come together to shape the gene expression, which ultimately is going to be a determining factor for our health. So this field has just exploded in the past decade, and we are actively learning every day about the interplay and the significance of these genes and the best ways to support them and things that suppress them. But it's definitely important to remember that the genes are not everything, and it's maybe 15 to 20% genetics, 80 to 85% environmental insult.
Yeah, and people, especially my background in women's health, people with family histories, and they got a BRCA test and carried the gene, the variant. It sends them into a tizzy, and that in and of itself, it is frightening. And I do see the benefit when you have critically ill patients, such as psychiatric patients, and they need some help fast, and you really need to do medication, but they're failing. I know that there are, I think it's called gene sites, right? That actually matches and helps people determine what type of med would work best for this particular person's genetic makeup.
Absolutely. Though I would also argue that if we understand the genetic pathways and run functional labs to confirm our hypotheses, that often we can really understand more about the biochemistry of the body and what's actually happening in the body, creating those psychiatric presentations. We often, if we're supporting the body appropriately with the right lifestyle choices and diet and supplementation, there are many times that people are able to resolve or manage very significant psychiatric concerns without medication, because they are filling in those missing pieces nutritionally, supporting their biochemistry, keeping inflammation reduced, balancing the neurotransmitters without having to resort to drugs. There's absolutely a time and a place. And the whole premise of what I do is that there's no one right answer for everyone. And so I would never discourage someone who needs it from using a medication for psychiatric support. But there are a lot of people who are hesitant to go that way. And I think it's good for them to know that there are other viable options. They often are a little bit more in depth and require a little bit more being self-driven to go this route. But there are options out there, because the genetics is everything about us. So it's our mental health, it's our physical health, it's our emotional well-being. That it's not the sum total of it, but it's kind of that background piece that sets the stage for everything else.
Well, it does. And between our genetics and our environment, as well as our emotional health, mm-hmm. and our physical health at a particular time, it can lead to the perfect storm for things to get crazy. And we can talk a little bit about that. But the term epigenetics comes up a lot. Mm-hmm. And epi, to me, sounds like above. Can mm-hmm. Can you give me give me that term? What does that really mean? It's just like a little while ago when I was talking with someone and we were talking about the microbiome, and mm-hmm. that's like a microbiome. Well, that sounds like a small living thing. And really it is, because you're talking about the small living parts of your entire inner sides in terms of your small intestine, your large intestine, and the bacterial counts for that. So, this term epigenetics, where the heck is that? Where is that involved in here? Is that a broader topic?
Well, so epigenetics we sort of touched on it without saying that word. So we talked about that gene expression and turning those genes on and off and what's actually working. This is essentially epigenetics. Epigenetics is the control of the genes and the gene specialization. But it's really that whether the gene is active or whether it's dormant or being silenced. So epigenetics is what makes each of us unique, because it's what changes little things like light skin or dark skin, green eyes, blue eyes, brown eyes, curly hair, straight hair. But it's also things like, is your single copy of MTHFR turned on or off? So that's epigenetics. And epigenetics can be influenced by a lot of things: nutritional deficiencies, environmental toxins. Trauma is a huge thing that influences epigenetics, and epigenetic expression can be passed through multiple generations.
I just read that and I was blown away that things mm-hmm. that happened to your great grandmother have evolved into things that may affect you. And you Absolutely. Might be looking at, where did this come from?
Mm-hmm. And so that can feel really daunting. Like, boy, each of us is carrying the weight of maybe 11 generations of trauma and discomfort and distress, and it kind of piles up. But because I am always optimistic, I would like to point out that epigenetics is not a negative inherently. So we can pass epigenetic wisdom and positive changes as well. And because epigenetics is reversible, we can do things actively to resolve generational trauma in and of ourselves. So regardless of the hand we've been dealt, epigenetics is reversible, and we can make active changes to put ourselves and our bodies and our future generations in a more positive place than we are.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. I'm glad mm-hmm. that there is positive, because people think, oh my God, I'm going to have this forever. Well, you are. Well, you are. Exactly.
Your genes are your genes. So yes, that part you're going to have forever.
Yes. It's your thumbprint, right? It's your thumbprint.
It's probably more unique than your thumbprint, but it is. You're never going to change your genetics, but you can change the way those genes are being expressed. And that is really critical. Because if you can change that expression, you can change the way that everything fits together in the body.
All right. So
and even though you can't change your genes, if you know what's going on with them, so let's say you have twos and there's only one way it's going to express, you can compensate for them. If you know, hey, I'm never going to make adequate choline because of my genetic makeup, then you can take some choline and compensate for that. But if you don't know that that's the issue, you may not find out until you're diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver. Still not too late, but now you have a harder road than if you knew and were able to be proactive.
Right. When we talk about 1 and 2, just so you guys know, Emily's saying 1 is 1 copy or heterozygous, and 2, peace be with you, is 2 copies homozygous.
Right.
Just so everybody's clear. So let's talk about methyl genetic testing. Okay. How does one? I mean, I know, but what is?
Oh, I know you know.
I know that you know because you taught me. But tell me what the person does. If they want to do this, do they have to go through a practitioner?
I think it's a really good idea to go through a practitioner. There are a lot of direct-to-consumer genetic tests out there, and they have varying degrees of value, but trying to weed through all of this can be a lot. It can be a lot for practitioners. So I split my time between mentoring practitioners and seeing clients myself. And so I see both sides of it, and I see a lot of practitioners struggling to piece together these 9,000 data points and symptoms and labs and make sense of all of it. So to ask the average person who may not be deeply steeped in things like biology and biochemistry, it can be a lot to say, here's your 600,000 steps, good luck with all of that. So I do think that there are significant advantages to meeting with a practitioner who has a background in this to help you kind of weed through it, because too often we'll see things that look dire that may not be that big of a deal, or you may see something that doesn't look like a big deal that we really should pay attention to. So the right practitioner can help you figure that out and set a course, whether it's to recover health or to maintain health, because we can use the genetics either way. I mean, ideally we'll use it proactively, but some of us won't consider looking at that until we really need to dig ourselves out of a hole.
Yeah,
so the genetics
see people late in the game sometimes, right?
Yeah. Well, I see a lot of chronic complex cases. So most of the people that I'm seeing, it's pretty late in the game. But then I get to see their children because they decide they want to be proactive and not let their kids go down the same road. So I do get to be proactive with a lot of people as well. So for the actual genetic test, I don't really recommend going with one of the direct-to-consumer tests unless you have a practitioner waiting on the other side saying, okay, let's get that done and I can take this material and interpret it for you. So what I typically would recommend doing for my clients is doing the Your Genomic Resource DNA test. It has to be ordered through a practitioner, so you can find practitioners who do that at yourgenomicresource.com. You could talk to Cindy, you could talk to myself. We can help you to get a test ordered and then interpret it appropriately.
So what is the test made up of? What do you get in your little box?
So in your little box, so it's a really easy test. You just spit in a tube. It's about this much saliva. You can take your time to do it. It doesn't have to be done like in 30 seconds. So it typically, to generate that much saliva, does take about 10 to 20 minutes. So don't try to do it as you're walking out the door, but you'll get your little kit. You'll spit in your tube, you'll close it up so the preservative goes into it. Make sure it's closed and the cap is on. Can't tell you how many people send it back with no cap on. So cap your tube and you just put it back in the mail. It goes off to Brooks Laboratory at Rutgers University. They run the genetics. It does take a while to do. Running genetics is not an overnight test. You want to allot probably about 8 to 10 weeks to get your test results back. It is worth the wait. So after 8 to 10 weeks, you'll get a little memo that pops up in your email saying your test results are ready, and you'll hopefully have your appointment already set up with Cindy or myself, and we'll be able to hit the ground running and give you an idea of what has set the stage for your existing health concerns, what may be waiting in the wings down the road, and so what areas you should focus on to bring your body back into balance and maintain good health in the long term.
It is true. The things that I found with mine were incredible. And something as simple as needing to help my body absorb fat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, I know that that has been helpful. I want to talk about conditions that you see a lot of that have either been not appropriately treated or figured out, or the person is really having a difficult time and they've been passed off from one provider to the other. Can you tell me a few of the things that you see a lot of?
I see virtually every condition that you can imagine. So I'm in an interesting position because I'm not a doctor. I do not diagnose and I do not treat. And then not being able to diagnose is somewhat liberating because I don't have to worry about labels, and I'm able to look at people just as people and kind of assess what's going on at a biochemical level, what's missing or what's in excess, and what we need to bring balance. So people come to me with all sorts of labels. I see just a tremendous number of people dealing with the full gamut of autoimmune conditions. That's definitely a big one. I see a tremendous number of people who are really suffering with mold exposure and an inability to detoxify from mold. Because here in Pennsylvania, we're in the midst of the wettest 18 months ever on record. We are seeing more mold cases now than ever before because there's mold growing in places where there's never been mold. There's mold growing in homes where there's never been mold. I mentioned I'm in Pennsylvania, so we also see an awful lot of Lyme disease here. And what we're seeing in the past year is that mold exposure can cause latent Lyme to re-express. So we're seeing a lot of people dealing with a combination of both Lyme disease and mold. But I see people with food allergies. I see people with chronic migraines. I see people with degenerative diseases. A lot of kids with ADD, ADHD, behavioral issues, food tolerance issues, people on the autism spectrum, and just really a huge number, a huge variety of cases. That's one of the nice things about the genetics is regardless of what your concerns are, your genetic code is what sets the stage. And so that's where we can find clues as to what may work better for you or what may have caused you to be more vulnerable to something than another person. If we have 4 family members living in a moldy home and one of them is really sick and maybe another one has some seasonal allergies and another one snores and somebody's totally healthy, we may not initially think, oh, it's the mold in the house because not everybody is sick. But that one really sick person may have just been dealt a more challenging hand when it comes to the particular detox pathways that are required for mold. And so that may be why it is impacting them at a deeper level than other people who have the same environmental exposures.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy because, you think you share your gene pool amongst your family, and that's why people have blonde hair in a family that everyone has dark hair. And then the joke comes out, oh, she must have been from the milkman.
Yeah.
You ever hear that one? I remember that one a long time ago. We do know, I bet you a lot of people do know MTHFR. But are there other, some people have read different books out there on genes, and can you give us, what's your go-to one? What are the ones, you're going to bring up? Oh, is this a good question or not?
No, there's no one right answer.
All right.
That's going to be my go-to answer, is that there's not one right answer for everyone.
Okay.
So for me, honestly, it truly depends on the presentation of the person that's in front of me. Because if you come in with chronic Lyme disease, then I have a certain set of genes that I will start to look at.
Okay,
but if you
give me
okay.
those genes. Let's go with that.
Okay.
Because which ones are you most interested in with that type of presentation?
So my colleague, Bob Miller, who wrote this amazing software program that you and I are using for genetic interpretation, the functional genomic analysis software, Bob did some really excellent research on chronic Lyme. So he looked at a chronic Lyme population, looking at their genetics, and we compared it to a control group to see where there were anomalous genetic variants. And so we were able to identify a lot of different pathways that are much more heavily variated in people who are dealing with chronic Lyme than in the average population. So some of the most significant pathways that we have found have to do with iron utilization. So one of the first places that I go to when there's any type of chronic pathology or chronic pathogen, whether it's parasites or yeast that someone can't get rid of, but especially Lyme disease, I will look at genes like the HFE, which are the genes that are associated with hereditary hemochromatosis. When they're variated, we're going to take too much iron into the cell. And then I'll also look at genes called SLC40A1, and those are the genes that encode for ferroportin, which is your iron exporter. So what we're finding is that many people with chronic Lyme have variants of both of these genes. So they're getting too much iron into the cell and not enough iron out of the cell. And so they're retaining all of this iron, and it's creating massive amounts of inflammation. So I'll also look at genes for catalase and glutathione peroxidase, things that would get rid of hydrogen peroxide, because if we have too much iron and too much hydrogen peroxide, we kind of explode in this catalytic reaction called the Fenton reaction, and they make a super damaging free radical.
Yikes.
And that's, and a lot of times that's a big thing that's happening with these people with chronic Lyme. So we get this inflammatory component from the excessive iron, and that iron is able to give that Lyme spirochete everything that it needs. So you can feed that Lyme profoundly with iron. We think about sugar as being the thing that feeds pathogens too often, but iron will feed Candida, iron will feed Lyme. So having excessive iron in the body just creates the perfect environment for these pathogens to really stick around and thrive. So those are some big areas that I look at with chronic Lyme. There are a few other pathways. Bob has done 6 phases of this Lyme disease study. So things like acetylation comes into play a lot.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
Acetylation is one of our phase 2 liver detox pathways, but we also use acetylation to control things like gene expression. So when we're acetylated or deacetylated, that's one of the things that can influence the epigenetic expression. And then we also have to acetylate our fats. So we combine our dietary fats with acetyl-CoA with B5 to make acetyl-CoA, which is going to be the building block for all of our hormones, both reproductive and stress hormones, as well as how we start to make energy in the Krebs cycle, where we ultimately make ATP, which is our cellular energy. So acetylation is really important. Acetylation is also needed as one of our pathways to clear histamine. So acetylation, just like methylation, which we're talking about with MTHFR, is a really important biological process that has many different roles in the body. But it's one of the things that came up as very dominant in our chronic Lyme groups.
What about, I remember reading one of Bob's research reports, carnitine.
Mm-hmm.
Was that one of them that was a problem with Lyme people?
It can be. So that was in, I believe, phase 1 of the study. We saw a lot of issues with poor fat utilization. And so we need carnitine to get our fats into the mitochondria. So really, we have to remember the foundations that our food should be our fuel and our building blocks for everything else in the body. All of this biochemistry, this doesn't happen by magic. It happens from the foods we eat. So if we eat terrible food, then don't even bother with the genetics, because that's the foundation you've got to clean up, because your food becomes you. Absolutely, not in some type of esoteric way. Your food literally becomes you and your fuel and your cells. And so if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So when we think about carnitine, even if you're eating good, clean fats, if you don't make enough carnitine and you're not taking carnitine, then those fats are just going to be excreted in stool. They're not going to get into the mitochondria to actually make hormones and energy, which is what they should be doing.
And you know what? We always talk about pooping because that's what our big thing is, in this functional spaces. If your bowel movements are floating, they are full of fat. So everybody's got to look. You got to look in the toilet, I tell you. So
and I'm always floored by how many people tell me, well, that's what you want. You want your stool to float. No, you do not. So no. And so if it's floating, if there's an oily sheen on the water, you are excreting fat.
Yeah.
And
you're
there are
tired, right? You're tired.
Oh my gosh, you're tired. You're probably toxic. You may be riddled with oxalates then, and you're probably hormonally imbalanced. So lots of things go wrong when you're not breaking down your fats. And your listeners should know that it's not just, my fat is, or my stool is floating, I should take carnitine. There can be a lot of different things. It may be carnitine, it may be a need for B2, it may be a need for choline and bile, it may be a need for lipase. So here again, there's not one right answer for everyone. And working with a functional practitioner who can help you kind of get down to the nuance of your particular reason, that's where you're really going to have success.
Right, because it is very, very individualized.
Yeah.
Truly is. What you mentioned doing functional testing. Yeah. What type of tests do you like to coordinate with someone's gene report?
So with the genetics, I think the genetics can help to guide us in the right direction as far as functional testing goes, because there are hundreds of tests that you can run, which is actually going to be relevant to you.
Right.
So
right.
When in doubt, the primary one that I recommend running is the urine organic acid test, because I think it's just one of the most phenomenally useful functional tests. The genetics gives us the predispositions, and then the organic acid test helps us to see how those predispositions are actively playing out in the body and whether we need to do anything about it. So when we combine those two pieces, now we have answers as far as gene expression, or the epigenetics go. Now we can see where there really is an issue and where we may need to be more aggressive than the average person to deal with that issue. So the urine organic acid test is, I think, just a fantastic counterpoint to the genetics. But then things like Dutch hormone testing, I think, is a phenomenal tool as well. So if you're dealing with hormonal imbalances, if you're dealing with brain fog, fatigue, anxiety, high stress, then hormone testing may be a good one to do. And if you have a practitioner who's well versed in things like the Dutch test, then you can actually use both the Dutch and the OAT to get clues as far as things like the potential for Lyme disease or the potential for mold exposure. So those are things that won't show up in the genetics. I mean, you can have all of the genetic polymorphisms that would give you problems with Lyme being chronic, but if you never get a tick bite and never get exposed to Lyme disease, then none of that really matters for you in that context. We need that environmental insult along that pathway for it to be a problem. So the do you have Lyme, that's not going to be found in the genetic test. So you've got to look other directions for there. And the OAT and the Dutch can both give us good clues. But I run a lot of blood chemistry as well. So we talked about the SLC40A1 and the HFE. If I saw those variants, before I would start messing around with supplementing for the iron, I would start by running some blood labs and seeing where the serum iron and the TIBC and the hemoglobin and hematocrit and ferritin are, so that I know, again, is that being expressed? Is it creating an issue? And if so, how aggressive do I need to be in balancing and managing it?
Right, because not all of those genes are actually going to cause a problem. I guess I would go back to that, that true perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
One of my questions relates around nutrition. we do find that a lot of times you can actually, by changing the patterns of what you eat, how you eat it, how often you eat things, or supplementation can really make a difference on helping these genes kind of be quiet.
Exactly. So it's that epigenetics, that gene expression, turning genes off by doing the right things for your body. And often we need to take a multifaceted approach because, again, we're not dealing with just our own genes. We're dealing with that multi-generational epigenetic expression. So we can see huge changes in genetics with things like meditation. So calming that stress response can be hugely impactful for changing the gene expression. Things like intermittent fasting can be a powerful tool. There's things that happen in our body when we put it into a fasted state that don't happen any other time. So when we talk genetics, we really have to think in an evolutionary context because our genes didn't get this way overnight. They have been passed from person to person. And we, as Homo sapiens, are living very differently now than people did for the hundreds of thousands of years before us. And our genes have not caught up in a lot of ways. So we're seeing problems now that 10 generations ago, 15 generations ago would not have been an issue. We are eating things that our bodies don't recognize as food. Our tongues recognize them, and so our brains go, yep, I'm eating something. Our bodies will break it down and get some nourishment, but there are over 80,000 chemicals that are in our air, our water, our soil, our food, our personal care products, and our bodies that have never been adequately studied for safety. They've never been studied in conjunction with one another for their impacts on the body. And our genes our detox pathways are not really equipped to handle that. So when we change something as foundational as what we put into our body and what nourishes us, and we go from something like a standard American diet to a more whole food diet, we're going to see positive shifts because, again, garbage in, garbage out. So our food becomes our enzymes, becomes our cells, and the better the raw materials that you put in, the better the outcome, regardless of the genetic presentation. Now, we may be able to find nuances within the genetics that tell us certain categories or types of food or patterns of eating may work better for you than for someone else. But I can tell you my one thing that I would say that is right for everybody, eating real food instead of packaged and processed food across the board is going to take you in a positive direction.
You can think about that, and as a practitioner who, even prior to getting into integrative health, people used to say, well, I don't know what to eat. And I would just say, okay, the concept is this: eat it the way it came out of nature. Treat your food like you're going to go out in your backyard, you're going to pick it, and that's what you're going to have. And if it's stuffed in a box, if it's, quick fast from the freezer, from a pack, it's not real food. Maybe once upon a time it was, but it has been given too much additional treatments, too many additives for preservatives. So when you take this in, as you're saying, and your body has to break it down and assimilate it, it might be too much to get it through its process, because everything that you take in has to go through detoxification. And you need
everything has to be metabolized.
Yes, because you have to break it down to its smallest pieces so that your body can deal with it. And do you find that people really truly are they honestly not educated in what they should be eating?
I see a lot of people who have educated themselves, but do we have a baseline of solid nutrition education in this country? No, we certainly do not. We as consumers have put the emphasis for far too long on food being cheap and convenient. We live in a society that values that. We don't want to pay a lot for our food, and we want it to taste good and be ready when we want. We don't want to wait. And So as a result, we don't think about the long-term implications of what that means and what it means for our bodies. So what I always ask people is, what is cheap and convenient about a hyperactive child? What is cheap and convenient about a parent with Alzheimer's disease? What's cheap and convenient about cancer? This is what our industrialized food has given us, because we're saying, no, I want it cheap and I want it now. And so we've been given so much bad nutritional advice, just absolutely wrong. A lot of it is because the food industry has a very powerful lobbying arm. The FDA doesn't always look out for consumer interest. And so we have all of this junk that has just been approved into our food supply, and we've been conditioned to think that it's the same thing as what our great-grandparents were eating, and it's really not.
It's not. Can you imagine someday you're going to fill out a survey before you can get your health insurance? It's going to require you to put a 3-day diary of your food intake, and then they're going to rate you. Yeah.
So good luck, insurance companies. I try to get people to fill out a 3-day diary all the time. It's not going to happen. So you might get one day. Maybe
that's all you get is just the one day.
But and I think it's a good indicator of how poor our understanding of food is. I want all your listeners to stop and think about, what did you eat for the past 3 days? What did you eat for dinner last night? Not just, oh, I ate meat and a veg and a starch. What was it? How much was it? Was it 3 ounces of protein? Was it 4 ounces? Was it a cup of vegetables? Was it multiple vegetables? And then did you snack before that? What did you have for lunch? Did you snack between breakfast and lunch? What did you have for breakfast? The further back we go, we're eating on the fly. We're not sitting down and eating mindfully and thinking about the foods that we're eating. We're not savoring the foods that we're eating. It's just, in between activities or in between, I'm guilty of this myself, in between clients, I'm shoving something in my mouth because it's the only time I have to eat, because we've not prioritized sitting down and eating, which is such a foundational piece for us. So people have a really hard time trying to recall what they're actually fueling their bodies with, unless they've been forced to because of significant dietary restrictions. Unfortunately, that's usually what it takes to really shine the focus on our food.
I was listening to a little documentary series, and it was talking about someone who had whatever her horrific problem was. And one of the first things that the patient said is, don't tell me I have to give up eggs, because I'm not giving up eggs. And she says, well, hold on, we're going to look at this and whatnot, and did some food sensitivity type testing, and it wasn't eggs like off the chart. It was off the chart. And she had to tell the woman, listen, we got to stop eggs right now. Forever, no, but whatever. And on occasion, you might get some resistance, but if people have been through the ringer and they're really ready to make change, they'll do it. They'll do it. You might have to just, you have to give it in a language that people understand. It's kind of like that risk and benefit type thing, right?
Yeah. And we have to understand, especially with food sensitivities, food's a big thing. Food is, as much as I just sat here and said, your food is what makes you and all of your cells, there's more to it than that. It's also tradition, and there's all of these layers of emotional things. That's why we emotionally eat or don't eat. I mean, food carries with it more than that nourishment or lack of nourishment. And I think that we have to keep that in mind when we're talking to people about changing their diets, especially if they're changing really important or fundamental parts of them. And we as clinicians can be objective and say, look, the testing says this, but then as humans, we also have to be compassionate and understanding. And I'm a firm believer that if you're going to take something out, you've got to put something back in, because you still need to eat. And so it's one thing to say, hey, don't eat this, but we should probably follow that up with here are some other options that will work better for your body. And here's an explanation as to why you have to give up this thing you're not wanting to give up. And here's the light at the end of the tunnel where we may be able to get it back into your mix. I came into nutrition because I hated seeing people feel like food was the enemy. I love food. And excuse me, if we can figure out what's really going on with the body and bring it back into balance, then maybe we can give food back to people and have it work for you instead of against you.
Right.
You know,
I
set
mean,
the stage.
one of the worst things I heard was a friend of mine has a coworker who very, 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 very large, very large. And she was getting married and she wanted to start a family. And a couple of the coworkers had gone out to the pharmacy and some sort of, buy one, get one free of some type of a chocolate treat, candy. And they bought her 2 bags of it. And I, as to celebrate that she's engaged and she's a little bit older, was getting married and wanted to have a family. And that to me is a lack of understanding. They think that, yes, we love our chocolate, we love, our sweets, but no one really identifies how problematic that can be for the gut, for your brain, for infections. I mean, when you're looking at cancers, what fuels cancer? It's sugar. That's why when you have a PET scan, they give you that radioactive glucose IV, and they watch to see where the cancer, or if the cancer lights up everywhere. Yeah. So everything can be given in a little moderation, but people have to invest in themselves, especially if they're not well, if they don't feel well. The I deserve it factor is just can't be in play here. They have to really force themselves to do what is best for them, especially for that time period of while we're trying to correct things and help the body help itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's so much of it. Like, how do we best set the stage and how do we find that balance? I'm a believer in moderation. If your body is in balance, it's really easy to moderate things. If you are really out of balance, moderation is not necessarily going to be your friend unless you're happy with maintaining the status quo, because that's really what moderation is going to do for most people. So if you're at a point where you're really happy with your health, you're feeling good in your body, you're sleeping well, you're moving your bowels, you have good mental clarity, you've got energy for days, then yeah, enjoy a little bit of chocolate balanced out with your whole foods. But if you're not happy with where your body is, if you are out of balance, if you are actively trying to recover your health as opposed to maintain your health, that's a different playing field. Then you need to do different things nutritionally. I mean, from a supplemental end, what we need to regain health and what we need to maintain health are 2 totally different things. So, for people who are doing a lot of supplements to regain health, once they feel better, they may need to really scale back on what they're doing versus because you don't always need the same thing. And it comes down to that with diet as well. We might need to be much more stringent and assiduous and about our dietary choices, our sugar consumption, our macronutrient balance, things like that while we're sick. But then if we've really recovered as opposed to just compensated, we should be able to adjust and balance and indulge now and then. Absolutely. Now and then being the key.
Yeah, nobody wants to say that, you can't have a glass of wine or whatnot here and there, because that is a good thing. Think about the resveratrol in that glass of red wine. It's really awesome. And, this is a very important part of any healing regimen. And as with my practice and your practice, you do emphasize food. We emphasize food at Pursue Wellness. And my daughter, Kara, is a registered dietitian. And what I like about the things that she has access to is not only by me doing their genetics and figuring out a program for that, but she can take that into the food side and help people plan their meals. I can't tell you that we have a wonderful platform that helps us design around certain factors.
Oh, awesome.
It is so great. It's so great. So, she can provide the recipes, and, a lot of people will say, well, just tell me what to eat and I'll do it. Well, that's part of the analogy of show a man how to fish and he can fish for a day, teach a man how to fish and he can eat for a lifetime. And with teaching people and showing people how to prepare or how to make it more convenient. We are like big into crock pots. We are big into the Instapot because it really, because people can actually have a beautiful whole food meal in a short period of time. You haven't destroyed the food. It's, it's not char broiled out on the grill till it's crisp because you forgot. This is real easy to do stuff, and we love to do that. We just are wrapping up 21-day whole food spring reset, and it was great. It was really great because it was a program that gave 15 days of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and what they did is they showed you how to do the meal prep. Then it moved on to so that you could have a little bit of leftovers, so you wouldn't have to be thinking of doing it every single day, 3 times a day. And we did inspirational things. We offered, my job was Thirsty Thursdays, talking about alcohol, Thirsty Thursdays. And we gave an extra recipe out on the weekend so they could try something new. And it was a great variety. It was great. So we hope to, even for people who aren't struggling, but they really want to learn, they want to make their health better. It really does start with learning about how to eat. And I'm saddened. I'm saddened when I see and hear from people who have young children that they'd rather go and do a fast food burger because they can get 2 burgers for $3 rather than go to the grocery store and get like a half a bag of apples for $3. It's our society is it's gone in the wrong direction, if you ask me.
And so I'm a mom of 3. My kids are 4, 8, and 11. And so we are in the throes of spring craziness right now. We have softball, we've got soccer, we've got orchestra, we're running all over the place. And I can absolutely understand that impulse to want to just drive through. I don't even have to get out of a car. Somebody's going to hand me food. I can feed my kids in between activities. This job keeps me honest. I always want to practice what I preach, so you will never see me going through a drive-through. If you do, I will close up shop. Because there will always be a better option, whether it's driving another block down to the grocery store and going through the salad bar to get a quick real food meal. There are ways that you can find quick whole food ways to go. But I mean, running around, I can absolutely understand where people would have that impulse and think, okay, well, I'll just do it this one time. But that can be such a slippery slope. And with our kids, it does not teach great habits at all. And so we have to be really careful and mindful about the behaviors that we're modeling. This is why I won't do it, because not only am I modeling behaviors for my kids, but for all of my clients and for people in my community as well. So I am going to hold myself to that standard. So I need to prepare in advance. We all should set ourselves up for success. And if we're, getting home at 5 o'clock and standing in front of a refrigerator going, what are we going to eat? You're going to find yourself reaching for those convenience items. But if you can plan ahead, if you can just write down a list of meals at the beginning of the week. Think about when you have activities versus when you have time to cook. Maybe do a batch cook and portion things out and freeze them, or use the crock pot. Or for people who are histamine intolerant, which sometimes goes along with Lyme and mold, then the Instapot is definitely the better option, because histamine builds up in foods as they cook slowly. So I would say generally, for high histamine, do the fast cook from the pressure cooker. If histamine's not an issue, then make your crock pot your friend. But no matter what predispositions, so especially meats in the crock pot will build up a high level of histamine.
What about
but not
leftovers
in the
then?
So it depends. There's not one right answer for everybody. I
Oh
told you
my
I'd break
God,
it
you're
out.
just killing me.
But so if histamine is a major issue for you, then you would want to eat leftovers within a day or two. If they're going to be left for longer than that, portion it out and freeze them. Freezing will stop the breakdown of those into histamine. So there's ways to get around it, even if you have a high degree of histamine intolerance. But freezing and uh, pressure cooking are great if you're histamine intolerant. Bone broth made in a slow cooker is super high histamine, but you can make an unbelievably delicious and flavorful bone broth in an Instapot in like 45 minutes.
Get out.
Yeah, and then it's much lower in histamine. It's high
Wow.
in glutamate, so still not right for everybody.
Yeah, tell
But
everybody what glutamate causes.
so glutamate causes good things and bad things, but glutamate can cause a lot of anxiety. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It wakes your brain up and gets you thinking outside of the box, thinking creatively. I'm a high glutamate person. Cindy, you're probably a high glutamate person. I don't think that you could do this type of genetic work without being high glutamate, because it does require a lot of outside of the box thinking. But once you're outside of the box, glutamate can take you down some dark roads and get your mind kind of spinning. And if you find yourself with not being able to turn your brain off, especially at night before you go to bed, or a lot of high anxiety because you're an overthinker, worrier, you may be a high glutamate person. And then something like bone broth may actually make that worse rather than better. So a lot of people are using it to try to heal the gut. And for some people, it is a really good choice. But for others, it can definitely take you in the wrong direction.
So if someone is finding that they've made their excellent bone broth and they're really healing their gut, but they're swirling and twirling, or they're wired and tired, is there
Mhm.
something they can do for themselves to help?
Yeah, here again, if you understand the nuance of the genetics, we can take more targeted steps. So for some people, it may be helping to facilitate glutamate to GABA conversion. So GABA is the calming counterpart. So where glutamate gets you thinking outside of the box, glutamate or GABA lets you go, but everything's going to be okay. So we convert glutamate into GABA using an enzyme called GAD, or GAD. And that uses B1 and B6 as cofactors. So we can give more B6 or more B1 if that's the case. Sometimes that can balance us out. We can use things like Pinocchio, or Bob Miller put together a couple of great products from Professional Health Products for this, the glutamate scavenger line, to kind of calm down that excessive glutamate production. So if we know where the glutamate is coming from, then we can know the best ways to support it. For a lot of people, it would be to pull out the bone broth and use other mechanisms to help to heal the gut. Things like serum bovine immunoglobulins can be really helpful for people who can't do things like glutamate or bone broth.
And this is associated with genes, right?
It is. So if there's GAD variants for that enzyme that turns glutamate into GABA, that's where you probably want to facilitate the cofactors. There are other genes that can cause you to naturally make too much glutamate, or to misconvert the glutamine, which is what people are wanting from the bone broth for the gut, into glutamate, which is going to make them overexcited and anxious and worried. So there are a lot of different places where things can go slightly wrong. And you may be high glutamate and I may be high glutamate, but we may have gotten there from two totally different directions. So what we do about it might not be the same thing. And that's where understanding this can be such a profound and powerful tool.
Right. Do you remember the game? Oh gosh, what was the name of the game? That Twister.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the game Twister?
I do.
Well, I just seem to think sometimes that this whole genetic thing is so intertwined that if it is, right foot green or whatever, you may end up on a pathway that looked like it was going to be fine, but now there's something else blocking it. So learning, like you said, the nuances of how this is affecting the person. You can't do just genes. You have to look at the person, their condition, etc. And then you have to do your twister game and do it the best that you can to help them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Bob is want to say, it's like a 3D chess game played underwater. There's a lot of moving pieces, and the environment is going to be that influencing factor as well. So
yeah, I like that. Yeah.
yeah, we're dynamic, and we're interfacing with the world and our food and changes in barometric pressure and air quality and all of these things. And so we're not a product of just our genetics, but if we understand that piece, then we can better cope with the world around us.
After I came to your first conference, that was in Hershey, Pennsylvania, speaking of chocolate, Hershey, Pennsylvania, where everything was chocolate. Did you notice that? They served us chocolate like it was going out of style. It was,
oh my gosh. And if you tried to take it away, they would just bring you more.
Exactly.
It was never ending chocolate.
Exactly. But you know, the one thing that was a huge takeaway from that is, I'm like, I think in the future, babies will be born, they'll be swabbed, you'll get a profile, and you'll know how, it's almost like some instructions to how to take care of this baby and help this baby grow and do the best that it can. And I'm hoping that something like that will help prevent illnesses. The population has grown to be such that there's so much chronic illness, and it's sad. It's sad because people are missing days from work. They're feeling unfulfilled. They're not enjoying their lives. People, you know, find themselves in desperate situations, and you know, we're all in a very toxic environment. We all know that. And before we end, I want to ask you more about the glyphosate in breast milk.
Sure.
Can you tell me how that came to be? Because that just blows my mind.
Sure. So this was a two-part study that was pioneered by Moms Across America. And they did the first national test. They had 12 participants, and they found glyphosate, elevated glyphosate levels in 3 out of the 12 samples. And I'm a founding board member of GMO Free Lancaster County, and we are an affiliate organization of Moms Across America. Because we are in an agricultural area, we felt compelled to follow up on this testing and test people locally. So we tested 10 additional women, and we found elevated levels of glyphosate in one of them. I think our group was largely people who were eating organically. I was one of the 10 women in our group who was tested because I was nursing my son at the time. So interestingly, the level that we were able to detect glyphosate in the breast milk was anything above 0.71 parts per billion, which is a fairly high level. The European Union's allowable level for drinking water is 0.1 parts per billion. So we were already much higher at even the detectable limit. The one woman in our local group who did test high on glyphosate did happen to have a child with neuroblastoma, which is a common childhood cancer. We cannot say that the glyphosate caused the cancer, but it is an interesting association to note. And the reason that we felt so compelled to do this testing is because glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup weed killer, is so ubiquitous. It is in our food, it's in our water, and it's in our bodies. And Monsanto, now Bayer, who bought Monsanto and now makes Roundup, which is what contains glyphosate, has said that you just pee it out. You know, if you get exposed to it, you just pee it out harmlessly. And so this testing did go a long way to show that, you know, there may be cases where it is not being fully excreted, that it may be actually metabolized in some way. Being water soluble, I mean, there's water that is passed into breast milk. So we can't say that it was metabolized into the fat. We don't know that for certain, but we do know that the levels are concerning, and that something as foundational as breast milk can be impacted by it. but I did have the very good fortune to speak with Professor Gilles Eric Seralini just a few weeks ago at the Environmental Health Symposium, and he expressed to me that it is not just glyphosate that is the problem with Roundup. And so I think it's important to share that message. We have taken Monsanto's word for it that glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, but glyphosate in isolation does not do what Roundup does to plants or to people. It is really the finished product, which can contain anywhere from 39 to 61% glyphosate. The rest of it is inert ingredients, which themselves have the action of Roundup, even without the glyphosate. So some of Professor Seralini's work has shown that. So we have to be really mindful about even our language and where we shift the blame, that this is truly like a Roundup as the complete product, that glyphosate is not safe. I don't think we should just use other glyphosate-based herbicides and pesticides and think that we're okay. But the dangers of this product go well beyond just the glyphosate. And I don't know if you saw that yesterday, a jury awarded a couple $2 billion in the latest Roundup lawsuit. And this is $2 billion. So this is the third ruling against Monsanto and Bayer in the past year. The first two cases, there was over $70 million awarded to the plaintiffs in each case. In this case, it was over $2 billion because it's coming out that Monsanto knew that that Roundup causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and actively worked to suppress that information. People were made to think that it was safe, and that's why they turned to it. I mean, I mentioned I'm going to soccer games, I'm going to softball games, and I can tell you after it rains, all I smell when we get to the field is Roundup. We are poisoning ourselves with it, we're poisoning our children with it. It is not a safe alternative, and we've got to work to get it out of our bodies. It's one of those things that can have a negative impact on genetic expression. And Professor Seralini said that the best ways that he has found to detox from glyphosate are by eating fresh herbs. So what he said was fresh herbs on a warm plate so that it wilted a little bit and those volatile oils start to come out. He said it almost doesn't matter what herb, whatever appeals to you culinarily. So bring those fresh herbs in when you're eating, and they can have profound benefits on the body.
Wow. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Well, this has been fabulous. And you have a lot of information well beyond my capability. So if anybody is interested in talking with or learning more, I'm going to say a couple of these websites, but they will be on the bottom, associated with Emily's bio. And I want to say, you can reach her at TOLHEALTH.com, correct?
Correct.
Correct. And if you're interested in more about the software, education about the software, you can look up your, Y-O-U-R, genomic, GENOMIC resource.com.
You got it. And so the Your Genomic resource, if you are a practitioner or you think you would like to go through the training for nutrigenomics, then you would go to the Your Genomic resource. If you are a client or a patient who wants to learn more, then go to the tolhealth.com.
Yeah, that makes it clear. Very good. Very good. I want to thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed our talk.
I did. I always love talking to you. Thank you so much for having me. This has really been wonderful.
Great. This is great. Us chicks got to stick together, don't we?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, everybody out there, you have listened to yet another episode of Living with Lyme. If you have not already subscribed to the website, please go to www.livingwithlyme.us. If you subscribe now, you're going to get a bunch of recipes from my daughter that are healthy and good for our Lyme community out there. For everybody, enjoy. If you want more information about Pursue Wellness, you can go to pursuewellness.us. I want to thank y'all. Em, thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, Cindy.
Till next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.